of life are blowing and the storms.
Welcome to our 9th session in United Methodist Polity. The title of this session is Church Property. And as you see in Frank's book, it's a very brief chapter. You see that it is a very important part in the 2000s of the paragraphs in the Book of Discipline. And I wanted to say just a word about that before we move on to what is very important about today, and that is that we have a special guest with us, Bishop Linda Lee, who is the bishop here, bishop in residence here at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. So let me say a couple of words about property, and I'd like you to note that in your reflection as well as reflection on the conversation that Bishop Lee and I will have in a minute or two. I just want to point out the very important issue about especially local church property is to know the trust clause. It's part of the constitution of the church. It's also in those paragraphs and must be included in every deed to property, as well as it is the understanding of our endowments. And the Board of Trustees of your local church needs to understand that they hold in trust for the annual conference the property of the local church. The local church does not own that property. It's owned by the annual conference. The other issue is that if you are a pastor of a local church or on staff of a local church, please find out where the deeds are to the property and to make sure that they are deeded appropriately to the United Methodist Church or any of its predecessor organizations. Again, check the opening pieces of the Constitution, and you will see that you don't have to change the deeds every time there was a merger or an emergence of a new denomination. So for instance, if your church was chartered and deeded as a Methodist Episcopal church, today it would be a United Methodist Church. So just be aware of that, and many times lawyers are not clear about that, and you may need to point that out in our Constitution because as pastors, as clergy in our denomination, you also are expected to know our Book of Discipline. And the final thing I would say is to understand this notion of the stewardship of the property and the local church, that there have been pastors or churches that have decided to leave the denomination, and they simply thought that they could leave and take the building with them. And the answer to that is no, they cannot. If that decision is ever reached, that building and all of its contents are property of the United Methodist Church. And the bishop rightfully will have an officer of the conference, usually the district superintendent, will come and basically lay claim to that building legally as part of the United Methodist Church. So I would ask you to read Frank's work here. I would ask you also to read the property sections so at least you know where they are and you follow them because they are legal and important with your Board of Trustees. When property or any encumbrance of that property, a mortgage or something of that nature, is at issue in your local church, it's important that one does that in relationship to the annual conference, namely in the person of the district superintendent, or when required, it comes to the annual conference session. So that's the lecture on property. I would like to welcome Bishop Linda Lee, who has been the resident bishop in the Michigan area, not annual conference, area. She presided over 2 annual conferences, West Michigan and Detroit, in the Michigan area, as well as the Wisconsin area. And we came to know one another in those 2 places where you were the resident bishop, but now you're bishop in residence here. I want to thank you before the students get to see our earlier conversation that back in 2012, as you were getting ready for that general conference, and there were many things going on in the state of Wisconsin, that we had a wonderful conversation that I would like the students to see and then rejoin us for our conversation together.
Okay.
We're blessed to be with Bishop Linda Lee of the Wisconsin area of the United Methodist Church today. Bishop Lee is a member of the Connectional Table. of the United Methodist Church that has been considering the structure of the church and how changes might need to be made there. She is also the leader of United Methodists here in Wisconsin, as this state deals with issues around collective bargaining and the state of teachers and other public employees. And so these are the issues that we were blessed to come here to Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, to talk to Bishop Lee about. We're glad you're with us. And you've been with the Connectional Table and have been considering these issues, and just wondering what it is that you would like to tell us about the future of our denomination, which we care about very much, and what the leadership is saying about this very important body that connects the general work of the church.
I think there's a few things that are important as we look toward the future. It's clear to all of us at that level of leadership and elsewhere in the church that we have to do some things differently. So we've come to a time of looking at that very seriously and trying to consider the ways that will allow the mission of the church to go forward and the work of making disciples to continue and to even be more effective. So the changes that we've talked about as we include structural changes, including the vote of the council to recommend a set-aside bishop, including the development of a board or a group that would give oversight to the work of agencies, a small leadership team, and financial changes in terms of how we raise funds. So we're looking at all of those things, and there are questions that have come up around each of them, around the Council of Bishops and the idea of a set-aside bishop. It does raise questions about the role of the bishop if there's a person set aside by quadrennium without residential responsibilities. My understanding of the proposal at this point is that the person would be a liaison, coordinating, facilitating. It would be that type of a role to help the parts of the church to talk to each other better so that the work of the whole church could work together better. At this point, we do still tend to function fairly independently of each other and come together when we need to, but that role would allow us to work together consistently, and there, I believe, along with others, that will be a good thing for our denomination. I do think it's an effort to really help us coordinate our work so that the mission can be more effective in the 21st century. And we are living in a time when communication has changed, the people in the pew have changed, the demographic of the U.S. Is changing. By 2050, it'll be 54% people of color, 46% people of Anglo descent. There's just a number of things that we are needing to attend to, which are very difficult to do the way that we're currently structured and functioning.
Knowing your passion for the church as well as for your centrality in Christ, there is almost a hopeful joy of this consolidation, and the notion that we move forward in rapidly changing times rather than getting bogged down in the process of legislation. It almost sounds that we are mirroring a world in which democratic processes haven't found their way forward. They're getting bogged down. No matter how much we love them, they're not really being effective in government or in our church governance, and that this is a way forward. Am I reading that rightly in your face as well as your comments?
It is the desire of all that I know to assist the church to move forward and the spirit of the church to move forward. The language is still often survival language, but the intent is for the movement that is Methodism to continue to impact the world in ways which are positive, which assist those who need assistance, and which ultimately bring Christ to those who don't know Christ yet. So ultimately, I believe that's where everybody wants to get to. And we're looking at and exploring what are the best ways to help that happen.
That over the years, bishops need to have a bit more authority, although we're afraid to give them to you. And wondering how this feels as an individual bishop, but how the council is feeling about this move, because clearly bishops have concern about appointment making in terms of guaranteed appointments, in terms of carrying forth the program and the evangelism and the mission of the church. And although some may say they're grabbing more power, which I think is a cynical way of saying it, it could be seen that if we are an Episcopal church, then we are actually giving the bishops the authority that is necessary to lead us forward. That would, to me, that would be the positive read of this motion. I'm just wondering how you're feeling about it. I'm only responding to what I read and know.
It's actually part of what came to mind when I was thinking about this. We are an Episcopal system. We already have a bishop who functions as president, who does help us to do the work that we do in our efforts to lead the church. And so in that sense, it wouldn't be that much of a change, except that the residential responsibility would be taken away. So I understand that for some people that could look like a change in the role of the episcopacy. But I don't know that it's that much of a change. The change would be no longer having residential responsibilities if you're serving as the president of the council. But we also have an ecumenical officer who often has been retired, and because of that has not had residential responsibility.
And we often forget that.
Yeah.
That you are not only our bishop, but you are also the president of our conference.
Yeah.
By discipline.
Yeah.
And my students often get hung up in this difference, but it's very, very important that in your office reside both of those responsibilities. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you were right on both scores.
Not a problem, but that part would change for a bishop who would be set aside. So that wouldn't no longer be a part of the regular responsibility. So I see why there's a question about what it means in terms of the role of the episcopacy, but I don't think it changes the role of the episcopacy. It changes the role of one of the bishops who is a part of that body.
And ecumenically is probably better understood than it is denominationally.
I've also heard the perspective that perhaps if we go this way, it will be giving too much power to the council or to the bishops, so that there would be a more predominant role. I do think we would want to be careful, because the question came up about who would decide who the set-aside bishop is, and would that include general conference agreement in some way or something. And so that, because in some ways the person would be the person to speak the things that the general conference says on behalf of the council, and could therefore be seen as doing that on behalf of the whole church. And so those kinds of issues are some of the things that have come up as well. But still, I think it would be a very helpful thing for the church to have a person whose function is to help the church bodies work together consistently. I just think that that's something that could be very helpful.
So we are at a point where we need to make a decision whether we are a legislative leadership or a leadership that can function in response to ever-changing times.
That's the whole notion that we're functioning under right now, and that is to be adaptive, so that it is possible, as things continue to change, to continue to offer leadership. And I know that that's got to happen in these times. Things are changing so rapidly, consistently, that we have to be able to move and adapt as things happen. So I think it's very important.
Let me ask another question on this score. The second point you made was actually to streamline the functioning of the general agencies, it sounded like, of the church, which are huge in number and in function and in scope, easy to establish, and sometimes for such a time as this, but nobody has a sundown clause on when that time might be over, or how several agencies could work together more effectively than separately. In just the general understanding of leadership, the two things that a leader needs is the authority around people, money, which also includes structure. And it sounds like that's exactly what is going to happen here, that in the way we are all led, which is with a bishop at the helm, set aside in this case from residential responsibilities, but clearly over the bureaucracy, that we are again getting, and we don't like the word control, but maybe authority over these two things that seem to be out of control, or diffuse, which is the money and the structures. Do you want to expand on that a little? Because I think that goes with number one, is this number two.
What we are looking to do, I believe, is to have our resource agencies, program agencies, functioning in a way that continues to offer what local congregations need to be and make disciples for Jesus Christ. So the way that we've been doing it with the large numbers of people and the money we've been spending is in a time of change, and it is related to the finances of the church, but that's not all. And I know that the intent is that that's not the driver. The driver is that we see that there are good things happening as the result of our mission and ministry through our local churches, and we want that to continue. So as we look at streamlining, we are looking at what seem to be the best ways to coordinate activity and resourcing so that the mission and ministry can continue. The concerns related to that have been about how to ensure that the voices of the people who represent the church and who are about to represent the culture more fully, in terms of people of color, in terms of younger people who we really desire to, well, they're going to some of us within 5 to 10 years will not be here in terms of the leadership role. We will not be able to be here. And so how we can ensure that those who are coming through the work of the church now can help the church be what it needs to be in, I'm going to say, their world. We're all in the world together, but the world I grew up in is not the world my grandchildren are growing up in. And so it's a different world in that sense, and they know their world better than I do. So to have the structures in place that can ensure those voices continue to resource and guide the decisions for the future of the church is very important. The voices of the people of color, who are going to be the majority of the population, the voices of our central conferences as we talk about being a global church. So all those voices need to be at the initial table where decisions are made. And that is a great challenge when you're talking about decreasing numbers and representatives and that. So we talked about the fact that representation doesn't always require the physical presence, but it really could make a big difference in terms of how that gift is received, if it can come directly from the mouth of those who are being represented or being discussed. Discussed, yeah.
I might ask you to expand on that a little. As our bishop, and I think all of our bishops are all of our bishops, what is your hope for the future of the United Methodist Church? Because you clearly have in you as a leader, a spiritual leader and a leader of the church. What is your hope for our future?
My hope, part of it is consistent with the intention that's coming through the connectional table, through the inner operations team, through the, put that in. There are several new little groups that are functioning on behalf of all of us. Yeah. And one of the priorities is to have vital congregations. And the belief is that if we direct our resources to assisting congregations to being as vital as they can be, then that mission and that ministry will be ongoing through the changes and the ups and downs and the unpredictable things that the world presents to us. And so that's the image, and that's the wording that is used in our talking and in the things that we're writing about vital congregations. Well, my vision is that we would indeed have vital congregations in which the people of the churches hear God's call on their lives as lay people to offer their witness to the reality of a living Christ in today's world because of their experience of God, and out of their experience of God and their gratitude for the boundless love that they're experiencing, they offer that to the world in the ways that is needed. And my vision would be that that would happen in the communities in which our churches are located. So that the church would be the place where people find that there is a power that is greater than anything that they're experiencing, any kind of tragedy, that there's a God that is able to bring them through to the other side of that, and that there's a reason to celebrate that people are healed, that the lame get new legs and the blind get new eyes. I just think Christ is still moving in the world. And so the church is the place. I envision people finding that out who don't know it yet. So that's my vision.
As you were speaking, I was thinking of work that I had done in seminary, my research, that called our early bishops the chief evangelists of the church. And the witness that you just gave, basically, that's what the mantle that you carry. And through the work that you're doing through the website and new technologies, that mantle and the infusion of spirit that comes with that, and actually the responsibility you call from us who serve the church is a great blessing. And therefore the structure supports that rather than is the message.
Yes.
And so I want to thank you for that mantle. And would say that, so therefore, what the Connectional Table does is supports what you've just witnessed, which is that we are still about the evangelization of the world.
Oh, yeah.
For justice.
Yes.
But it is still rooted in that vital piety of a redeeming God and the living Christ with us. Am I on board with you?
It is witness and justice together. And to be a witness, we have to be a disciple ourselves. And when we are those disciples, we can't help but to respond to the call of Christ and to offer that love and that light.
Yeah.
Just can't do anything else.
There you go. With all of the demands on your life to lead the church in this time, and now I'll ask it so it's there. You have been very intentional as a leader also to care for your own spiritual life and foster your personal discipleship. And I'm just wondering if you might share with us how important that has been to you in what are probably one of the most difficult periods to be a bishop in the United Methodist Church because of the huge transitions through which we are going. And oftentimes we don't know in kind of the intimate setting of this kind of interview, how do you maintain your discipleship? Because clearly you witness out of that place. And if you'd share that with us, it would be a blessing.
One of the things I do is to take Sabbath time, which a lot of people know already, but I find that it's really critical for me to do that, to know that I've set aside some time and a place that I know I'm going to just be with God, and that I'll be able to read and pray and listen and cry and lament and do anything I need to do about the things that are difficult and the people that are difficult and the things that just aren't right in the world, and that I have the time to then hear from God. And always in that time there is assurance and reminder that God is with us in the midst of all of it, and that God hasn't left us. And so no matter what's going on, we can count on that. And so it continues to take me deeper. And the harder and more stressful, the more difficult things are, the more I find I have to go there if I want to lead in the way I believe God has called me to lead. Because it could be easy to get caught up in other things and in the frenzy and in the conflicts and in the things that happen when this kind of change is going on. And it's not that I never do get caught up in it, but I find that I can get reconnected and centered sooner when I keep that time for God and me happening. And so for me it's daily and it's weekly and it's additional to that. A couple of people that were models for me were Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi, who was a model for him, I discovered. And one of the things I read in Martin Luther King Jr.'s biography was that not only did he do the work that was the work of justice, but he and those who marched with him and did those things, they fasted and prayed. They didn't just go out and march. They fasted, they prayed, they used the spiritual disciplines as the foundation from which to do the work that they did. And that's been my approach, because I read that before I actually entered ministry. And so that's been my understanding of how to deal with the difficulties, is to have that strong foundation, and that allows you to go do the more difficult things.
You are serving the people of Wisconsin as well as the United Methodist Church here. And the national news, of course, about Governor Walker and the attempt to modify, if not eliminate, collective bargaining for our public employees, our teachers, and others. Speak about how that has been as a leader, because your witness on behalf of the church and its stance around worker rights and other things is very clear. But you've clearly been called into question about taking a stance in this, which is now in the government, and just to help us with where you are with that. But also it seems that it grows out of your very centered sense of your Christian call and leadership. So if you might share with us.
Things that happened related to Governor Walker and the collective bargaining started with a personal response that I wasn't quite aware of until later. But early in his making public what he was thinking about doing, I felt compelled to write a letter as a private citizen about my concern about the possibility that people's voices would not be able to be heard in relationship to their work environment and the benefits that they would have from the work that they did as public employees. I didn't realize at the time that I wrote the letter why my response was so clear. And I realized later it was because my mother had been a member of the Garment Workers Union all my life. And when I thought back on her role and her telling me that she was among the people who went to their boss to talk about time off and that, I realized she was active in the union. But she would tell me about the working conditions. She was a seamstress, and she'd be on, these floors in the heat in the summer and just different things. And of course, there would be family things where we might want time, and she'd have to negotiate about time off and those kinds of things. So it was out of my personal experience that I wrote the letter. And then, as a member of the United Methodist Church, I knew that we had a stand that we have about collective bargaining and the right of people to be able to do that in relationship to their work. So that together went into the letter that he got, and somebody from one of the newspapers found out about it, and from there it became a public document, which I stood by and still do, because I believe that in what we say as the United Methodist Church. Pushback came from people who said that I was espousing my personal opinion about it and that I shouldn't speak my personal opinion. And obviously they didn't see the letter or understand that I spoke the church's position and not my personal position on it in the letter.
Right.
So that's been an interesting response to get. And sometimes I've responded by letting them know that it wasn't a personal opinion. It is the position of all who are. It's the position of the United Methodist Church. Whether as a member you agree with it or not is our position as a church.
I want to think more with you about what we do as leaders of the church when we write or engage with public officials. And it is moving to me to think that your first move was a personal matter of counsel, almost a pastoral letter to a leader. And sometimes we forget that they are people too, and that they are motivated by personal issues, as if a government official doesn't have personal opinion. It's a very interesting juxtaposition that you were, but that was your first inclination. And the second is that therefore you both hold very public offices that represent large numbers of people on a very important issue. As a pastor, would that be the kind of spiritual advice you would give to us as we approach these very clear issues, to remember our personal relationship before our public duty? I'm wondering if you'd reflect on that, because my students ask me that question all the time.
I honestly was asking, was there not another way to achieve the goal he was trying to achieve without possibly eliminating the right of people's voices to be heard? And I really wanted to know. I thought there might be, I hoped it might cause him to think about whether there was another way. I really didn't expect a personal response, and I haven't gotten one. But I thought it might make him think about whether there was another way to achieve his end. It was after that it became clear that part of his intention at the time was to eliminate collective bargaining. But that wasn't even clear at the time that the letter was written.
Your sense of our reminder of that we are human beings first, and we serve other offices.
Yes, absolutely.
And they have greater responsibility. But I think it will be helpful for me as I teach my students and think about my own leadership, to remember that we may be passionate about issues, but issues are not disembodied from people.
Absolutely.
And so that pastoral sensitivity that you bring as a leader is instructive, I think, for all of us, and I just want to thank you for that.
Bishop, it is wonderful to have you not only for this interview, but to be a bishop in residence. And I'm blessed to share the office right next door to you. So I want to thank you on behalf of myself and our students, but as well as on behalf of the seminary. And I just wanted to begin because over the years that you were a resident bishop, you ordained many who had graduated from United Methodist Seminaries and from Garrett Evangelical. And I'm just wondering, as you come here to the seminary, what your observations are about the way in which seminaries prepare people for ordination. What are the positive blessings of that? And what are some of the gaps that you are seeing as you are living with us now?
I really appreciate the work of the faculty and the staff here at Garrett and at other seminaries that I'm aware of in terms of focusing on the theological and academic preparation of our students, which I think is really important in the local church setting to help teach others about the Bible, about living faith, about aspects of caring for one another, like in pastoral care, of teaching. So I think the academic background is really important. And the pieces that I know of, particularly here in the field placement, where students get experience before they ever, well, some of them are pastoring when they come, but they gain additional experience in the real world and opportunities to serve in ministry if they never have before. So I think all of those things are really important as well. And some of the students particularly expressed appreciation for the course that you've been teaching in terms of practical aspects of ministry.
Oh, yes.
Things like visiting a jail and visiting other places in the community to talk with the people. So all of those kinds of things I think are very good preparation for the students. The biblical study, of course.
Of course.
And then the other thing that I think Garrett offers in particular is the work in spiritual formation. And having the Reuben Job Chair as a place for students to focus in on that aspect of living the Christian life. I think though that's a very important part of the ministry here as well, and the role of the seminary here.
And that's been an important part not only of your role here, because I know you do spiritual direction or counsel students, you hold retreats for us, but we talked about this and the students just saw this in the interview, and I know this is a very important part of your Episcopal leadership, and that is the spiritual life of leaders, and especially leaders of the church. And I'm wondering if you would comment on that, because it was very, very important to your Episcopal leadership. Most of the folks that I know would say that this was the one thing that you constantly insisted was part of their life.
Yeah, I continue to believe that as spiritual and religious leaders, the most important thing we can do is to continue our work in spiritual formation, which is a lifelong, ongoing process. And I believe that we need to do it in a way that prepares us and equips us to be in the world, to face the greatest challenges that we have before us with an internal fortitude and strength that we can't get any other way. So the work of spiritual formation practices, Sabbath keeping, which is probably what most people will remember I talked about.
Yes, it is true.
I'm still talking about it.
Good.
And
it wasn't a momentary idea.
No. And it's scriptural.
Yes. One of the big 10.
Yeah. And Jesus practiced it and modeled it and called people to it as well. So it's not just Old Testament, it's New Testament.
Right.
And we can have that as a resource for our ongoing ministry in the world. And I think about Martin Luther King Jr., and a lot of people remember all the things he did, but I don't know how many people knew that he fasted and he prayed and he meditated, and he did those things as a foundation for going into the marches and into the difficult places. And that's how I see the importance of it.
What do you think the biggest barriers are for, especially for pastors? I mean, in a sense, where those who are pastors or deacons in the church are set aside, and I think it would really surprise a whole lot of laity to know that they may pray more than we do. They may take more time to do this more than we do. What do you perceive the greatest barriers are to taking Sabbath or having a robust devotional life?
Most of the pastors that I've heard from have felt that it is the demands of the ministry, the perceived demands and the expectations of others and the expectations they have of themselves as pastors. And the expectation still seems to primarily be that pastors are supposed to be available 24/7 because the work is so important. The ministry of the church is so important. So there's that lingering perception, I think, in the back of a lot of people's minds and sometimes in the forefront that this is what it means to be a good pastor. I think what we're needing to do is to understand that the best work can be done in a balanced way, and Sabbath keeping is one way to keep balanced in ministry and to keep centered in God. And in seminary, sometimes it can be really difficult to do that because of the 95 things, and when you get in the church, you only have 90. But
Right. We do not model this well. Yeah.
So to take the time every week, and you'd have to do a whole nother tape on Sabbath, so I won't say any more about it, except that it's really important for the balance of keeping healthy in ministry.
Well, I totally agree with you, and perhaps we will do a whole tape on this. From a leadership point of view, not simply from a spiritual formation point of view. I once was upbraided in that very course that you referred to because I did a lecture on Sabbath about this time of the semester, 3/4 of the way through, and the students basically said, that's all right, but you really don't mean it. And I thought, well, I understood all the papers they had, so I simply canceled the last paper. And they couldn't believe I did that either.
Wow.
And the deal was that they would need to substitute the time they would have spent on that paper in Sabbath. And I still get phone calls and messages and actually sermon manuscripts of those who did that it made the greatest impression on them. And I did it simply because I was being called out, that theoretically it's a good idea, but how do you really do it? So there's a great deal of courage, but I'm with you on that. Foundational for leadership, not an afterthought.
Yes.
So I appreciate that we got to that really early on. Let me turn to some structural matters, because as you and I sit here, we could talk a long time about formation, and I think that really is quite important. But in terms of leadership, formation and structure go together as well.
Yes.
How do we carry this out? And prior to the 2012 General Conference, we spoke a lot about the role of the bishop and a set-aside bishop who would not have residential requirements, so that they could basically align the denomination, that they could respond adaptively to the challenges that came, a whole plethora of things that we do not need to rehearse. And some of that passed and then was struck down by the Judicial Council, and we were left without any restructuring and a whole lot of things going on. And I'm just wondering what your reflections are in terms of what the council has done and how that's affected the denomination moving forward.
I think the council has responded by making some changes structurally, which include having one council meeting a year with forums in between for active bishops only, for learning and for sharing best practices. And for other things I don't really know about because I'm not there as a retired person. But those are the things I know that they are coming together to do so that they can, with each other as active bishops, have the time to grow, to learn, to study, to share, and to worship. So I think that's one way of aligning the leadership role for the active bishops, residential bishops. Another place where the leadership is coming is through some structural alignments, which we heard about at the General Conference in a couple of different kinds of ways. And there has been a restructure in the council of how the council functions when it is together. So that's also been a way of trying to put in place the things that are needed so that the council can lead. The other piece of it is keeping a clear vision. And one of the things I think has been a real intentional practice is staying focused on our foci, so that everything we do in every general area of the church is looked at in light of the foci that we have identified. And our major vision, which was agreed that we wouldn't change, which is to transform the world, to make disciples and to transform the world. So that decision to stay with the vision for a period of time, I think we said until it happens. Yeah. And I'm not convinced we'll stay with exactly the same wording, but I think we'll stay with the same concept and the same purpose and the same direction as we see it unfold and grow and deepen. So that's another way I think that we are looking to lead and finding ways to lead consistently and clearly.
And with a healthy eschatology, it sounds like until it happens. It'd be a nice thing if that got added on to our mission statement for the transformation of the world until it happens. I want to thank you for that. We have talked offline about the importance now then of the president of the council. And I'm wondering if within the council, because it's very clear that there are disagreements, especially over issues of inclusion that have reached the news, Bishop McLee, Bishop Talbert, and others, how are those public disagreements dealt with in terms of the unity of focus within the council? Because it seems to me very difficult to do when you have 50 plus bishops, all of whom have residential authority, and there's no single authority over them, simply a presiding officer. And we have done this throughout the denomination. We give executive responsibility, but sometimes at the same time we take away the capacity to actually affect that executive responsibility. So I'm asking, how does that happen within the council with a president, but with these disagreements that are very public and important for us to pay attention to?
I think what I've experienced in the council is that we use processes of conversation and of discernment, which allow people's voices to be heard for the most part, and for the body to say where it is as a body. And then that is reflected as it comes out of the council. And there is a great respect for the person in the role of president. Each person brings very different gifts and different skills, and each has offered that in similar ways to the ways that each superintendent brings a different set of skills, each pastor. And so those things I have felt have been respected, and we have trusted that person for their time in the role to lead us in the way we need to be led. So Bishop Venner, when we had the conversation about Bishop Talbert at the last council meeting that I was in attendance, reminded us that we need each other, and that the most important thing we can do is to work together, knowing that we have differences. It's not a new message, but sometimes we need to hear it again and again so that we can remember as we're working through the things that we have differences about.
And under that, I think it just comes with your person. But under that, it seems like that what you are also affirming is that we are part of a connected body. And that's the way this works. And as I listen to you and have over the years in your own leadership, that's really foundational, our connection to one another. Yet it's often framed in a kind of a Western autonomy sense, that here we have 50 some autonomous bishops. And it's always political because of that autonomy, rather than a notion of something that joins us. Mm-hmm. Is that accurate to your experience? And what would you say to the whole church? Because I think the whole church, at a certain level, waffles back and forth between connectionalism and congregationalism and individual autonomy. How does that all? Does that question make sense?
I think so.
Okay. Well, you've always made sense out of something I said, so I trust it to you, Bishop.
I do think it's a process to align the roles of that are autonomous and that are corporate, to make them work well. Mm-hmm. But my experience in the council is that there's a great desire and intention to lead the church as a connectional body, as an organism which is one in Christ. And though there are absolutely differences of belief and perception and understanding, it is still the understanding that we are still one body. Mm-hmm. And there's no desire on any level for that to change. The desire is that we move forward as a body and that we move through the things that we are dealing with right now, like the issue of homosexuality and persons who are homosexual in our church. In the past, we've had other things that we had to work through. Early in the church, it was whether a pastor was divorced, and later it was the issue of slavery, and at some point it was the issue of women's rights, and there have been a couple of other things, not quite as impacting as those and as the one we're dealing with now. But we've been at this place before. So the concern and the question, I believe, is how we move through so that we come out on the other side of this struggle as a unified body in Christ for the sake of the world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the unity of the church also, I mean, we've seen the division of the church over the issue of slavery clearly, and not only what that did in the church, but also it did in the country in terms of resolving that issue, or at least resolving the issue of slavery. Clearly, civil rights is still very much with us today, and we need to pay attention to that. What I'm wondering, as you're talking, is that the bishops speak with one another in a conciliar voice with this at its basis. But it seems that the church is reflexively at this point going to laws. I mean, we're going to our judicial council to solve this issue, which seems from my understanding of Wesley is that would be the last thing that John Wesley would want us to do, that it is about conversation, as you talked about. And wondering, as Bishop McLee is basically in that place, and several others, Tom Frank has mentioned this in a long letter about this issue, whether this is the time for our bishops to model that publicly, not just within themselves, and make a statement about, that this is the way we need to deal with these issues within the church, and only as a last resort do we go to trial rather than as what it seems to be the first resort. that we have here. And just wondering what your thoughts about that are, because we don't want to be a church ruled by the judiciary.
Right.
We're a church of laws, but that's different than being ruled by the judiciary.
Right. My belief is that most of the people that I know of in the council do not prefer to go to law first, and that there's been a real effort to work and to model with each other. Yes, we disagree, but this is how we relate to each other. This is how we treat one another in the church, and therefore this is what we would ask of our constituency in the church. So I don't see that as the first priority or the direction that most of my colleagues would prefer to go. I think sometimes because of our discipline in our book of law, we find ourselves there, and then the question becomes, will we abide by the book that we committed to abide by in accepting the role or not?
The role of the bishop, you mean?
The role of the bishop, will we do that or not? So I believe that there's an attempt and a desire at this time to do the relational work and to look at restorative ways of settling the things that we have differences about in general, which is what we did in Wisconsin. We really wanted to find a restorative solution to a trial that we had there just before I left,
right.
So that it might do some good. Bishop Job said, do no harm.
Right.
And so though people have experienced harm, we hoped that in that case we could produce an outcome that might have some good for all concerned. And I think in some ways that has offered some possibility for that. And hopefully things will move forward there and in other places in the church in restorative ways. Which means that some people on either side of the concern will not be happy.
Well, right. Because it's not our punishment mentality within the culture. But it is within our book of resolutions and our social principles that's what we seek.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, we'd talked about this a bit before, and I'll just show this if you can get that on the camera. This was produced after you'd left the episcopate. Left is not the right word. It was time for you to retire, I guess, and you'd come here. But you put into motion this clergy and covenant a dialogue following the trial of Amy DeLong, and part of the phase of what shall be the result of this was to have this conversation that you've talked about.
Yes.
And I'm wondering what you saw happening in Wisconsin as you began this work in process.
In Wisconsin, we had quite a long-term difference of belief among the clergy about particularly the issue of homosexuality. And when it became clear that there would be a trial, we desired to provide opportunity for perhaps some reconciliation or healing. At one point, we even almost had agreement to bring in someone from the Mennonite Peace Institute.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
For dialogue that might lead to an outcome before the trial happened, but it didn't work out. So as a result of the trial process and where the clergy in Wisconsin came out, their verdict, One of the things that was required was a conversation with me and the superintendent and Amy and a person of her choice, that we would dialogue and bring a report back to the clergy session. So I was able to do that before I left. And what came back to the clergy session was a request for this covenant conversation. And the conference agreed to it, and the body was developed before I left, the group for the covenant, and they had the conversation then over the next year, and in 2013 this document was presented to the conference. I was actually very, very gratified that with the decision that the trial court made, because it was restorative.
Right, right.
And because it offered the possibility of moving forward in conversation together, and that went as far as 2013. So I'm not sure where it is now.
Right, right. Well, that's up to Bishop Jung to carry that forward as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the model that really comes out of this for me, instead of the first act being trial by jury, is actually conversation toward restoration.
Yes.
Which in many domestic disputes within the general population now, a judge will say that that's what you need to do, rather than the two opposing points of view in which you have to choose for one or the other, or some negotiated settlement. It's toward reconciliation then.
Yeah, well, and we did. That is actually in our discipline, that we want to do that first, and we did attempt to do that. And for various reasons, that wasn't the way that we could accomplish what we needed to in Wisconsin at the time. But that we did talk about those kinds of possibilities first, and even during the process.
Right, right. Why doesn't that make our news? It feels to me that this is the biblical way of going. It's the disciplinary way of going. It is, from my perspective, the Christian way of going. But that process doesn't necessarily make the news. It's only when we go to trial, and there's a whole lot of other stuff difficult, and I don't mean to diminish the difficulty of that, but it seems to me this is the hard work that churches and pastors and laity and deacons, and this is what we dedicate our lives to, this very difficult work, yet it doesn't make our news.
I think the culture right now that we're living in is really functioning out of a dualistic mentality, which is creating others who are enemy, and one of the things I think people in Wisconsin got tired of hearing me talk about was the fact that we are one. Scripture says so. Science is even proving it's true now. So that's the fact. So even though we may not feel like it sometimes, or believe it, or see how it's possible, we are. And especially if we're Christians, the scriptures say we are one in Christ, and I happen to believe that. And I think for some it's not exciting news. So it's probably the best news we could ever hear.
Yeah, it's the good news.
And if we actually lived it out, some of the other news wouldn't be necessary, as you're saying. I just feel like it's just not exciting enough to make the news. But I think it's the most important thing we can do in the church is to model it and practice it and learn it, and share that unity and what it means with others. Yeah.
So and this gets sharpened, I think, in our seminary education. We take our stands, we make our debates, and theologically that may help us. Iron sharpens iron. But I'm grateful for you pointing us to another part of who we are, which is the more human and spiritually godly part. This whole notion of what are our first principles.
Yes, absolutely.
And grateful for that guides all of the rest of this.
Yes.
Because it seems to me, Bishop, and you have helped me with your presence, that when issues of structure or power or authority are defeated or thwarted and the best way forward seems not to be there, you bring a sense of calm. And it clearly is deeply rooted in this other notion that you start with, which is our formation, our time with God, but these other principles that don't make the news that are fundamentally important. And I'm wondering if that's what guided your episcopacy, your ministry, your life with us here, and what you would say to us about that with the full authority of your office, not just as your person, but as your office.
I do believe that the most important thing we can do as spiritual leaders is to be spiritually grounded, which is another level of ongoing daily work of a different kind than what you do behind a desk and in a classroom and in a pulpit. And it's a work that does require the engagement with Scripture and the time to be able to hear and listen to what God is saying, and the time to lament and the time to worship and to develop that relationship like we develop other relationships. And it's not that God isn't there, that we stray back and forth. And so some of the things that I've experienced as a person, as a human being, as a Black woman, as a leader, some of those things, I don't know how I would have made it through to the other side, but I came through to the other side of them, and I know that it's because of the time that I was willing to make to be sure I had some time with God. And I don't know how to convince anybody who's not doing it how important it is.
But you're going to continue to try.
I'll keep talking about it.
I'm thinking about, you're talking about in a couple of years ago, the political problems in the state of Wisconsin, and how you got involved with those. I know that you've just been to Peru and the difficulties there. And it's that same kind of assurance that is not out of some sense of your power, but out of this deep reservoir that's so important.
I would say one other thing too. It doesn't mean that you're not proficient in other areas either.
Right.
And we tend in the church to think, and I've heard this so many times, she's spiritual, but not this or not that or not the other thing. And I like to think of it as we are spiritual and we also do this and this and this. Because we do.
But it gives a different urgency
Yeah.
if we're coming out of that deeper place.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, is there anything we haven't touched on that you'd like to say?
I think there's just one other thing that comes to mind.
Please.
And I think we have touched on our structure and our leadership. I think the other piece that we need to keep in mind is the reality of the changing hue of the population of the nation and of the rising leadership and Christianity and, as they call it, the global South and all of that. So that as United Methodist, we continue to do the work to learn what we need to learn from and about people from different cultures than European ancestry, so that at some point the church reflects the country and the nation and the world we still tend to have a European ethos.
Yeah.
And someday I trust that we will reflect in culture and language. Our ethos will really be multi-dimensional and cultural and lingual and color and will look like who we are really a part
Right,
of. So
right.
that's the other thing. A short word is cultural competency,
Yes.
but it's a lot more than that. It's
Right.
really being authentic, beloved community.
And global. I mean,
Globally.
truly global.
Yes.
But I began the class, I'm glad we're ending on that. I began the class by basically saying we are a global church by confession. And that's become more and more what the General Conference is saying. And then to try to pull that apart to say, but we are so Americanized and
Yeah.
Europeanized in
Yes.
that way.
Yes.
And that basically shapes everything. And you've invited us to this place that we already know we should be.
Yeah.
And so it is with our Christian journey. Christ has already been there. We're simply discovering
Yeah.
where Christ has been.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on, but not as a quiet one. And it seems like it's the exclamation point of all of the rest of this.
Yeah.
Is the global nature of the church.
Yes, sir.
And I'm just grateful you carry it in your person and in your witness and in your prayer. And I want to thank you for your time with us today.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Great. Good.